In today's video I'll be painting a Contemptor Dreadnought in Sons of Horus colors. But instead of a clean factory paint job, I will make him look like he has seen some action, with paint chipping off the armor and corrosion and the environment leaving their marks. A veteran who has fought 1,000 battles for the Warmaster, and even in death he still serves. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURES. I started with a strong Zenithal highlight. The intention here is that during the painting process I will use a lot of techniques that will darken the mini down. Therefore, I need to start from a high brightness value so that later I can sacrifice some of that brightness for the shading. But I was also using the Zenithal to create some contrast by pre-highlighting the model. You can see me spraying more layers of white on some parts, mostly around the right side of the torso. I do that to make those areas brighter, so when I paint the base color over them, they will create a natural highlight and establish contrast between the darker shadows and the brighter highlights. Once I was happy with the Zenithal, I loaded some Lupercal green into the airbrush. This was a pretty obvious choice since this is the official color for the Sons of Horus. I sprayed this on in many thin layers, thinning it down with some airbrush thinner. This requires some patience. If you insist too much on a single spot with the airbrush, the paint will pool and the air from the airbrush will blow it around on the flat panel, which will lead to spider webbing and uneven coverage. The trick is to apply a thin layer, except that it's not covering fully yet. Let it dry while you spray another panel and come back with another layer once it's fully dry, repeating this until the paint is fully opaque on all the panels. It takes some time, but it's still a lot faster than applying the base color by brush, which you can of course also do if that's what you prefer. You can already see that the parts which were highlighted with the Zenithal are brighter and more vibrant, creating some basic shading and highlighting on the model. This is far from perfect at this point, but it provides me with some guidance on where I want to highlight and shade further. So let's do just that, starting with the highlights first. I added some Samurai Green to the Lupercal Green, and this is a Chimera paint, and I have been itching to use it for something like this because I love this particular color for some reason, but you could also just add some white into the original Lupercal Green for a similar effect if you don't have this particular paint. Using the thin down mixture of the two paints, I did the same thing as before, but this time I only worked on the highlighted areas that were left brighter by the Zenithal and the base coat. The idea here is to brighten up the middle of the existing highlights more, but leave some of the previous darker color visible and to create a transition between them. When I was satisfied, I went one step further and added some white into the mixture to brighten it up even more. This time I used this mix to spray it into the middle of the brighter spots of highlight I created in the previous step. I know that this might seem too much highlighting for something that is meant to be grimdark and beaten up, but trust me, we will need this brightness later on. With that, the highlighting step is done and it's time to emphasize the shading too, and I will do some stuff here that will look a bit crazy, but don't worry, just like with the highlights, it will work out in the end, so bear with me. First I took some violet from Vallejo, but any darker violet color would do as well. This is a great shadow color for green and it will add some interesting tones onto the model. I was essentially doing the same thing as before with the highlights, but in reverse and with darker colors instead of brighter ones, an inverse highlighting if you will. I shot this violet into the shadows I created with the Zenithal and base coat combination, making them even darker but also more interesting with colors as well. For the next step I switched to a dark ink and shot it inside the violet shadows I created in the previous step. Finally I added some black into the night purple to make it even darker and used this mix in the absolute deepest shadows. I think it's worth mentioning that the actual products used are not super important, it's the logic behind them that matters and you can substitute them with whatever you have at hand. In this case, any three progressively darker tones of violet or purple will work just fine, you don't need the exact same ones I use here. With that, I was done with the airbrushed highlights and shadows and it was time for the fun stuff. But first I used a little trick that would help me in the next steps and also protect the work I have done so far. I sprayed the entire model with gloss varnish with multiple thin coats. Alright, after all the clean highlighting and shading, now it's time to do some messy stuff to bring this veteran to life, or you know, whatever you call the state dreadnoughts are in. Let's start with some oil washes to hide the obvious airbrush look, and to do that I will use my favorite water mixable oil paints from Winsor & Newton. You can of course use standard oil paints as well, mixed with white spirits, but the water mixable ones work just as well and don't require any fancy thinners, so I prefer those. I used a mix of raw umber plus black. I diluted them until they ran almost like water and I painted it all over the model. There is absolutely no need to be careful with this, just have fun and slather it on. I know that it looks crazy to cover everything like this, and even after doing this many times I still get a little anxious when I see this mess that it creates, but believe me, it will be fine. The nice thing about oils is that they dry super slowly, so now I just took some water on my brush and wiped the paint away from the surfaces I didn't want this on. And whenever I felt that I removed too much, I just added it back on again, and I can do it as many times as I want without the fear that it will dry on me. And because I used the gloss varnish over the airbrush layers, I didn't have to worry about ruining the paint job I had already done. On some of the flat armor panels that are fully in the light, I wanted to wipe away the paint fully, so I used some pieces of foam and makeup applicators to do this. The gloss varnish helps here as well. If I used matte varnish instead, it would be harder to remove the paint fully due to it sticking in the texture of the varnish. But if I wanted to go for an even dirtier, more weathered look, that might actually be a good thing. Once I was happy with the result, having removed most of the paint from the flat panels but leaving them in the shadows, the recesses and all around the rivets, I switched to another oil paint color Burnt Sienna. I wanted to use this color to start the corrosion and environmental effects on the model. Our Dreadnought is meant to trudge through some alien planet with a lot of orange dust on the surface, something a little bit like Mars, simply because the orange contrasts nicely with the green. I wanted this red dust settling around some of the rivets and flowing down some of the panels, and the Burnt Sienna will be the base of these environmental effects. Now we are getting somewhere with this project, but for now the whole model is just green and it's time to start dealing with everything else as well. I took a big brush and some slightly diluted black paint and blocked in all the elements that were meant to be either black or metal so that we can finally see some definition on the model. I had to be careful not to paint over the green parts, of course, but this is a pretty big model and things are quite easy to reach. Plus, when I messed up, the gloss varnish underneath still helped me to wipe it away relatively easily with a wet brush. At this point, I realized that I spent quite a bit of time working on the shoulder guards, getting them nicely highlighted and shaded, but according to the color scheme, they should be actually black. Oh well, it was good practice at least. When I was done with the black, I took some gunmetal grey from Vallejo and base coated all the metal elements with it. I used the black under this so that I would have a uniform color, not a mishmash of green and white, and also because I wanted the metals to be quite dark in the end. Before turning to the base and the details on the model, I had to do one more thing. Once again, taking advantage of the gloss varnish, I had to apply the transfers. The big flat panels on this model make this part quite easy. I put some water over the spot I wanted the transfer to sit on, and this allowed me to move it around and position it relatively easily. Then, when it was in place, I put a little decal softener over it. I used the brush to remove any bubbles and creases, and when it was dry, I painted some matte varnish over the whole panel, integrating the transfer into the surface. Now it looks like it was actually painted on. In the meantime, the metals have dried, and now I use some good old Agrax Earth Shade over them to shade them and make them look a little dirty. And while I had it out, I used a little watered down Agrax over the transfers as well, so they are more in line with the dirty, dusty look of the panels around them, and they don't look so artificially clean. All the shades, the oils and the transfers needed a bit of time to dry, so I thought this is a good opportunity to pay some attention to the base. First of all, I removed the model from the base. It was secured with some tack, which can be a pain to remove, but as you can see, it becomes quite easy if you use a blob of the same tack to peel it away. To build up the base, I used some cork sheet, making sure to always measure where the feet of the model would be going. It's super annoying when you build a cool base and realize that the model can't stand on it properly. It definitely hasn't happened to me before, and anyone claiming that it did is obviously lying. Once the cork was in place, I used some ground texture on it to make it look less obviously like cork. I added a little dirt and gravel on top in some places to add even more variety, and of course, what would a Warhammer base be without a couple of skulls, so obviously I added those as well. I primed the whole thing black and it was time to paint it. I overbrushed the whole thing with some Kalahari orange, and then I painted on some medium rust from Greenstuff World, which acts a little bit like a red rusty wash. Honestly, I was just making this up as I was going along. It didn't matter too much in the end since I was planning to cover the whole base with a metric ton of pigment powder, so these colors only served as the base for that. Speaking of which, I used 3-4 different colors of pigment powders over the whole thing, placing them kinda strategically in a way that the brighter ones went over the darker ones. When it looked like a strong sneeze could turn my whole table orange, I dropped some mineral spirit over the whole base to fix the powder in place once dry. Now I needed to pin the model to the base since it would be somewhat difficult to glue it to the dry pigment powder. To do this, I cut some paper clips and placed them in little holes I drilled in the Dreadnought's feet. At some point I also realized that I only needed 3 and not 4 since the Dread is stepping forward and the heel of its right foot is not on the ground. I pushed the pins in through the layer of pigments into the cork, and once I was happy with the placement, I glued him in place with some super glue. Now comes the really fun part. It was time to do some detail work and all the weathering effects. Using the samurai green from the airbrushing step, I highlighted all the edges on the model and marked all the little rivets as well. In some of the dark areas where the samurai green would stand out too much, I used Lupercal green instead. On top of painting all the edges, I also added a couple of small marks and scratches around the panels, keeping them as thin as possible. To add to these, I took a small torn piece of sponge, dipped it into samurai green, removed most of it on a paper towel, and created some random chipping with it on the armor panels, especially around the edges where the paint is more likely to be worn away. With that done, I started working on emphasizing the rusty dust effect that I started with the burnt sienna in the oil painting phase, and also inside the bigger chips I created with the foam. I used watered down dark, medium and light rust from AK Interactive for this, going from darker to lighter colors and applying them in a progressively smaller area. To complete my highlights, I also added some white into the samurai green, and I used this to edge highlight some of the most prominent edges. I paid attention to make this highlight thinner than the previous one, and I didn't always fully cover the whole edge either, creating a dotted line instead. For the black panels, I went rather simple and used some dark sea grey for the initial edge highlights, which I followed up with a thinner highlight of medium grey. And for the metal bits, I used gunmetal to highlight the edges and also created some simple volumetric highlights like on the barrel of the gun. At this point, the model was mostly done and I only needed to add some finishing touches and extra details. I painted the rocket pods red, highlighting them up from a darker shade to a lighter one on the tips of the rockets. The eyes are a quite important part of the model, so I paid some extra attention to them. The whole eye socket got a coat of black, but the sculpted lenses I painted fully white. The lenses got a coat of red ink. Then, using the white again, I painted the front-facing 2/3 of the lens and covered it with orange fluorescent paint. Finally, I added a little bit of white again inside the orange to make it glow. For the gun, I wanted to do an easy burn effect on the barrel, so I sprayed first some Seraphim Sepia over quite a large part of the gun, and then Druchii Violet inside that, and finally some Drakenhof Nightshade at the very end of the barrel. I painted some matte varnish over all the green panels then, and finally I brushed on some of the same dry pigment I used on the base over the legs as well to tie the model better into the environment. I painted the base rim black, and my veteran Contemptor was ready to spread the glory of the Warmaster among the stars. Thank you very much for watching until the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it and maybe even learned something new. Don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and see you in the next one.